Welcome. I am Alan Benson, and once again, it is my pleasure to facilitate yet another virtual event, the African American Initiative Criminal Justice Summit. AAI is a policy initiative that was organized in 2010, featuring a wide array of primarily African American stakeholders, leaders, and operatives that come together to discuss and address issues that confront the African American community. It draws input from across Kentucky and the nation. It is co-convened by a multitude of organizations that support this common objective. Our co-host for this event is the Louisville Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. The sorority has served as co-convener along with multiple organizations and joining AAI over these years. AAI is very pleased to present along with this prestigious committed organization as partners in this endeavor. We are also pleased that we are continuing our collaboration with AARP of Kentucky and WLOU Radio, who is simulcasting this event at 1350 on your dial. And we are also live streaming this event on Facebook Live. Now, at this time, I would like to introduce to you our moderator, Senator Gerald Neal, who will introduce the co-moderator and the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan. I'm very delighted to be here, and I'm delighted that we have viewers today to take part, actually, in this very important discussion. And we're very delighted that we have the panelists that we have here and that I will be introducing shortly. Louisville's police department and its communities are in crisis, with major changes needed immediately, according to the top to bottom consultant review released a short while ago. Relationships between Louisville Metro Police personnel and many communities, especially Black neighborhoods, are deeply strained, the review by Chicago's based Hillard Heinz found. And those relationships among the city, its residents, and its public safety workers will continue to worsen until LMPD embraces a clear path to improvement, consistent with national best practices. This 155-page report includes 102 recommendations to turn around a department Hillard Heinz says has failed to establish mutual trust and provide equitable treatment across the communities it serves. It is our intent in this particular discussion to bring light to the subject matter and actually explore where we are and where we're going and what we can do to get there, and joining the community along with the police department who protect and serve as well. So I'm happy to have joining with me today as co-moderator, Judge Denise Brown. Judge Denise Brown has been a member of the Family Court Bench since 2015. She is currently serving a 2-year term as Chief Family Court Judge. In her role as Chief Family Court Judge, she is also a member of the Metro Criminal Justice Commission Board. Judge Brown is active on many boards and educates the community and promotes confidence in the judiciary. Judge Brown is also a member of the Louisville Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, where she serves as the second Vice President, Program Planning and Development Chair, and member of the Social Action Committee. Welcome, Judge Brown.
Sorry, I was on mute, but thank you very much.
Yes, well, we're very glad to have Judge Brown. We see that as a win from the very beginning. But we are so delighted to have 4 very knowledgeable, involved, and committed individuals in the subject matter that we're going to discuss today. We have with us Cheri Dawson-Edwards. We have Erika Shields. Cheri Dawson-Edwards, by the way, Edwards, I'm going to introduce her in more detail as we go, as she begins to present. We also have Chief Erika Shields. We're delighted to have Chief Shields with us. In addition, we have Ryan Nichols. We have Ryan Nichols, who has a tremendous background in law enforcement, and we're very happy to have him to contribute to this discussion as well. And we will have David James, who will join into this discussion as we go along, who we all know is the Metro Council president. So the way we're going to proceed is we're going to ask each of our panelists to give their presentation, so to speak, of anything that they particularly want to get into to frame who they are and what do they bring to the table in terms of this particular discussion. So we will begin with Cheri Dawson-Edwards. Dr. Cheri Dawson-Edwards serves as Associate Dean for Diversity, Engagement, Culture, and Climate, and an Associate Professor of the Department of Criminal Justice in the College of Arts and Science at the University of Louisville. Holding a Doctor of Philosophy degree, she is a passionate educator who is an exemplar of a justice-oriented scholar who focuses on the intersection of public policy and criminal justice with a specific focus on race, schools, and juvenile justice. She also currently serves at the Kentucky affiliate representative on the National Board of the ACLU, with recent appointment as the nationwide ACLU Deputy Affiliate Equity Officer. Notably, Dr. Dawson-Edwards is an accomplished scholar with a variety of publications for scholarly audiences, policymakers, organizations, and the community. Welcome again, Dr. Dawson. We're going to begin with you, and wherever you want to begin in terms of presenting and framing this issue, if you would proceed at this time, it would be appreciated.
Thank you. And thank you for having me here this evening on this esteemed panel. I'm excited for this conversation. And I know that, you know, when I was asked to be on the panel, I was like, where do I begin? And I know that everyone else has plenty to say from their perspective, but if I can just provide a little context about mine. So I'm from Louisville. I was born here. I'm also a mom to a 14-year-old son and a 6-year-old daughter. My context, especially in the last year, may be a little bit different from the folks on the panel. As the unrest unraveled last year, I found myself caught in the middle of some worlds. So at the time, I was the department chair of the Department of Criminal Justice here at the University of Louisville. And that department also includes the Southern Police Institute, which is a 60+ year police leadership institute that has a really great reputation across the country and across the world. And so I teach criminal justice, but I also direct our college's social change program. And so you could probably understand where I fit as relates to my research interests, my teaching interests, and my community engagement. And it seemed like last year, all of the things that I've been talking about for decades finally became the forefront of a lot of other folks' minds. And so I want to start this evening by looking a little bit in the past. I always begin my classes with where were we? We didn't just arrive here last year. We didn't just arrive here in May or in March, depending on when people found out about Breonna Taylor. We've been here. What I can say is that I don't believe that there is a well-documented history of the local police and our Black community. There are snippets, but I haven't seen a thorough documentation of it like they have in Minneapolis. And I would, I don't have the time right now, but I would love for someone to take that on as their scholarship. But what I do know is that Dr. George C. Wright, in his book, Life Behind a Veil, looked at what Louisville policing looked like toward Black folks in the late 1800s and the 1900s. And I think we should start with an excerpt of that. So George Wright writes, in September and October of 1910, a white daily, the Louisville Evening Post, carried a series of stories detailing police abuse of Blacks. A story in the paper on September 8th told about a police officer following a Black woman for several blocks and firing several shots at her once she started running. Another article protested the arrest of innocent Blacks, noting that on one occasion, an officer arrested 4 men for no apparent reason. On October 10th, the Evening Post explained that the cause of police mistreatment of Blacks was, quote, to establish in every home of a Negro man and woman in this city a condition of terrorism, a living fear of the bully and the revolver. And so I start there because I'm not saying that 2021 looks like 1910 exactly. But what I'm offering is that if we don't tell the truth about the history and the interactions, we may not as a community quite understand why we are where we are today. And so he has excerpts of media depictions of police treatment of Black folks in Louisville in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And I think that there are a lot of people in our community feel like you could flip the switch and change the year and that they feel the same way. I'm not saying that that perception is, completely, wholly accurate, but I think that perception is reality. And if our local police department wants to do something to improve community relations, then we need to understand why our community feels the way that we do. And so I think, my bigger point in, being a part of this panel is to bring about the reality that we need some truth telling. And I know that the report or the top to down audit or whatnot you referred to talks a lot about how the community perceived or perceives LMPD, and that they need more voice and they need more agency and they need more input and things of that nature. And I think that that's true. I not only am I at the University of Louisville, where I teach criminal justice, I teach LMPD officers. I'm currently teaching a class, I should plug this. I'm currently co-creating a class with a recently former LMPD officer. He just left in January of 2021, who was one of my former students. And we're teaching a class called Policing Protest and Police Protest in a Pandemic. And so we're covering issues related to police militarization. We're covering issues related to what is community safety versus what is public safety. And I think I should probably explain that concept a little bit. And sometimes people are referring to a new concept called community public safety. So public safety, in my mind, is what the government thinks communities need to feel safe. And that might be the police. That might be whatever construct they create. Community safety is what the community feels like they need to be safe. And where those two might come together is with community public safety, and not just the government or the powers that be deciding who and why we should feel safe, but actually asking the community the kind of things that they need, and not just the community members that you want to hear from, but everyday folks. What do they need to feel safe? I know that the elephant in the room often when I'm talking about these things is the concept, the divisive concept of defund the police. When we talk about community public safety, there is an element of reallocating funds. In fact, community-driven public funding relates to three categories. The first one is reinvestment, and that is harnessing savings from reform and channeling them to community initiatives. The second one is upfront investment, and that's generating new sources of funding for community initiatives. And then the third one, most people are more familiar with, and that is the invest-divest strategy, which is shifting funding away from traditional law enforcement and correctional entities toward community priorities. So I am not here to advocate for any particular point. I actually show up to spaces like this from an educator shared language perspective, because that's what I have to do with my students, and my students are both social change warriors and they're police officers. Sometimes many generations, inherited police officers. And so I find myself having these conversations with people who don't see eye to eye pretty regularly in my classes and in any presentations or workshops that I do. And so I think it's important moving forward in our city that we have shared language and we understand what something means, and we're not defining them politically. I also think, and I'm going to just share an anecdote with that I had this past weekend with a coffee with my councilman. I won't say who this person was, but in his conversation with people who live on the side of town that I live, he referred to buildings being burned down during the riots last year. That's my elected official, not my elected official, but that's my council person. And what I think is interesting about last year's protest, or you can conclude this year's protest, is similar to what happened in the late 90s with the World Trade Organization, when they, protesters changed their mode. They had the internet, they were able to communicate better, the police had to catch up. I think what happened this year that made this year so different is that we had live streamers, we had organized live streamers. They showed us what was happening, to the extent that LMPD began to live stream. And I watched both because I wanted to see the different perspectives on the ground. And so why I bring up my council person saying that is that we all know that neither LMPD or the 502 live streamers or the protesters with their cell phones showed burned down buildings. Now, maybe they showed some garbage cans on fire, maybe a dumpster, maybe they saw the attempted lighting of a piece of plywood on the Hall of Justice, but there were no burned down buildings. And as long as we have people, especially our should be trusted elected officials, using narratives like that, then our city will remain divided. And that doesn't have anything to do with LMPD. That also has to do with other leaders in our city, making sure that the narratives are true, that we are telling the truth. And so people who are not downtown or who are not protesting understand what's really happening down there. And so I will stop there. I'm sure I will have plenty to say as we move forward, but I just wanted to provide some framing. I do realize I'm the only person on this panel that is not or has never been a police officer. And so I, would be happy to respond to any questions after they present. Thank you.
You're on mute, Senator Neal.
Now we'll have, first of all, let me thank Dr. Dawson-Edwards for her presentation. And now we'll have Chief Erika Shields. Chief Erika Shields serves as Chief of Metro Louisville Police Department for a number of years, which she will tell us what those years were, because they were not in years, they're in months. In fact, she's new to us. She formerly served as Chief of the Atlanta Police Department for, I believe, some 22 or 23 years. I may not have that accurate, but Shields began her law enforcement career in 1995. There you go, working as a patrol officer before rising to supervisory roles. She holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in International Studies and a Master's degree in Criminal Justice. She is touted as an advocate for 21st century policing with a focus on reducing crime while strengthening trust and collaboration with residents and ensuring accountability among officers. Again, welcome, Chief Shields. If we can hear your presentation.
All right.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator. I appreciate it. So I'm really privileged and honored to have been included tonight, and I mean that sincerely. So thank you for allowing me this opportunity. I think, it's interesting when I listen to Dr. Dawson-Edwards, because so much what she says resonates in some shape or form with my approach and what I've experienced. We might look at things a little differently, but conceptually it is there. I think that when I look at it, where she referenced history to me is huge for everything that is police related. When you look at the space we're in now, back in the mid 90s, and this goes to her point about the government determining what was best, there was a real emphasis in the early mid 90s to lock up everyone, even for the most minor infractions. It was called the broken windows theory. And the idea was that if there's not graffiti here or a broken out window there, that people take pride in their communities and therefore there's not crime. It started as a concept that I think to some degree worked because it was legitimately focused on improving community. But what happened is along the way came what was created in New York City by NYPD called CompStat. And that was a unit of measurement to measure an employee's productivity. And so what ends up happening is over the next 20, 25, 30 years, CompStat became very aggressive on measuring numerical data for police departments. And our success or failure is defined by how many arrests we made, whether crime is up or down, where you're patrolling, never drilling down on the quality of the work. And so policing became very, very numbers driven. And when you're under pressure to produce these kinds of numbers, what ends up happening is people cut corners. And that's not unique to policing. The Atlanta public schools, the Chicago public schools had the same thing when governments put down, you know, that X number of students must score in this range. Well, what ends up happening? The scores get manipulated because other schools lose the funding. So similarly, what you saw in law enforcement is a lot of our work became so that we could hit data points to appease the public, to appease the supervisors. Layer onto that, at the same time, police were being asked to take on the role of social worker. I can tell you when police were first tasked with having to respond to those individuals who had mental illness, homelessness, what have you, police didn't want this role. That was not a role that law enforcement wanted. But what ended up happening is they were the only ones that people could call. And as a result, policing then morphed into this space for which, quite honestly, by and large, we're not qualified or trained to do. We're better today than we were, but it's not what it's not where the bulk of your time as a police academy is invested. And so as a result, you see a number of things happening. You see those areas that are poorer and typically minority communities, Black communities, getting over-policed because you can get the arrest numbers there. The corners are cut to get the arrest numbers. People are going to jail for issues for which they have mental illness, substance abuse. And I'll submit to you that in any city in America, the largest mental health facility is the jail, which is indicative of a much larger problem. And so it has created this environment where the practices of policing often aren't what they should be or how they were constructed to be at the onset. Further contributing to it is how we teach use of force. And I would submit that how use of force is taught across the United States is the #1 obstacle for getting law enforcement on track. Use of force training across the country focuses in on case law. Does criminal case law allow me to do X or Y? And your instructors like this because the law then puts forward a black and white line, and it's easy to teach a large group of people. You may do this, you may not do that. The problem with case law is it's the lowest level. What case law is teaching us and what we're teaching the employees is if you go out and you use force and how you conduct yourself is consistent with this particular case law, whatever the case may be, you won't be found guilty by a jury of your peers, by the judge. The problem is I'm not a judge, I'm an employer. And so we're teaching people how to be found not guilty, as opposed to saying, how about if I train you in such a manner so that you don't ever end up in court? And that means looking at the employees, teaching them so that the totality of their decision-making is stronger on the front end so they don't end up having to use force. And so I think that for law enforcement is going to be remain the biggest obstacle because that is done consistently across the United States. I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to hear from my peers, happy to hear from my new friends. More than anything, love that bow tie, Senator. Keep it rocking.
Well, thank you so much. You're very kind. And thank you for that presentation. Now we have Brian Nichols. Brian Nichols serves as president of the River City FOP Lodge 614. This organization's responsibility is focused on representation of police issues primarily in the Metro Louisville area. His experience in the FOP extends beyond his current role. Previously, he held the office of Vice President of the Lodge under the past two presidents of the Lodge. Additionally, he has significant experience in law enforcement. Prior to his role with the FOP, Mr. Nichols was an LMPD and LPD officer until 2020. He also served in the U.S. Air Force and Air Force Reserves until 2013. Mr. Nichols, what is it that you can tell us about the FOP laws and the issues that you think are important to this discussion?
Well, I would like to also say thank you for the opportunity for participating in this. The FOP always appreciates a seat at the table, as we like to say. We like to be part of the solution and find the best way forward for everyone involved. When we're talking about policing, and I'll echo on some of the comments that the past two presenters have made from my perspective as an active officer here in Louisville. But from the FOP's perspective, we are definitely interested in effective and fair improvements in policing. We always want to build community trust. That's vital to effective policing. We'll talk to anyone that's interested in solving the complex policy issues that come with policing. We do hold two very important basic principles in the talks of those reforms, that the reforms cannot end up harming the public or the officers that are charged with protecting Louisville citizens. So in that, we as the FOP actively try to engage with policymakers. We meet with the command staff of LMPD, the administration here of our city, Metro Council members, state legislators, both at the local, at the state, and at the national level, to try to effectively find that bridge to build. So those core principles that we feel are vital are met in whatever those reforms and policy changes may be. And when we're talking about reforms, that's where reforms occur, with policy changes, different mission identifications, and a clear presentation of what that mission is, and in law reform. There's been, a lot of talk about the contract, the collective bargaining agreement for officers, and that's just that. It's a collective bargaining agreement. It covers wages, working conditions, hours, benefits. It's not designed for police reform. That, like I said, that comes with policy and legislation. And here on the Louisville Police Department and the then LMPD, as we merged, our policy and procedures are constantly evolving. Our training programs are constantly changing in an effort to keep up with national best practices. And that's noted in the Hilliard and Heinz report, and many calls for police reform. LMPD had already been doing some of those best practices, teaching de-escalation training, teaching implicit bias training. The ICAT report said that our de-escalation training within LMPD overall decreased use of force. And so those are all very positive things. And we need to find those positive things and build on those. We do need better and more training. Officers need to be constantly trained. I think our police academy is one of the best in the nation, but then it needs to be followed up with continual training as our policies change and our procedures change and the desires of our administrators change. That message needs to be clearly communicated to the boots on the ground officers by the command staff. We are at a position here within LMPD where our manpower structure is in dire straits. Early in my career, I had time when I patrolled in the old city 4th District and the new Metro 2nd Division, which is the west end of the city, to have the ability to have enough manpower on the streets to get out and engage citizens, talk to business owners, talk to residents, spend enough time on a run to see what's going on in the neighborhood. Our manpower numbers are so short that doesn't happen anymore. I'm sure Council President James can comment a lot on things like that he did during his police career. And I heard Chief Shields talk about that base level of training and use of force and various things. And that's true to some degree, but I'll also say that in policing, and definitely in my career, there were far more times where I could have done something. I was legally justified in taking a certain action, and I did not. But we don't talk about those issues because something different happened. There was a different outcome. Police have an extremely large number of contacts with citizens throughout our city, throughout our state, throughout our country, to where it's a positive contact. We don't focus on those. We don't talk about those. Negative incidents get brought up, and that's where we focus on. But by and large, I think the men and women of the LMPD have a strong desire to serve this community, to build that community trust, and have a safe city. Our violent crime is unacceptable. It's at an unacceptable level. We are not adequately providing the public safety that we're charged with providing. And we need to address those things and find that way forward so the community is safe. Law enforcement officers are doing the job that the community and the administration want, and protecting the citizens of Louisville. And I am open to any questions and look forward to providing any assistance that we as the FOP might be able to do to make that happen.
Thank you, Ryan Nichols. Before we go to our last speaker, I want to acknowledge the fact that WLOU Radio and its listeners are on board, and we're collaborating with WLOU in a simulcast to get this message and this educational experience out. So we want to thank WLOU for that. David James. David James was elected in 2021 to serve a 4th term as president of the Metro Council. As president, he is chair of the Metro Council's Committee of the Whole and Committee on Committees. He also created the Committee on Equity and Inclusion, which he chairs. In 1984, James joined the Louisville Police Department to begin his career in law enforcement. He was the first African American to be awarded Rookie of the Year. He was served as a patrolman, a detective, on a SWAT team, and a certified police officer instructor. James has held elected positions of president and vice president of the Louisville Fraternal Order Police. He was the first and only African American to serve as FOP president and vice president. James was also part of the United States Army Reserves between 1983 and 1989. President James, welcome.
Well, thank you, Senator Neal, and thank you for having me here today. And hello to all my panel members with me. I just wanted to talk a little bit about where we are today and where we're going. You know, since the tragic incident of Breonna Taylor, as a council member, the council's done a few things. Our first thing that we did in June was to pass Breonna's Law, which is the no-knock search warrant law for Louisville Metro Police. After that, we passed a resolution asking the mayor and the police department to be more transparent as it relates to releasing information to the public and the media. And then we passed the Civilian Review Board with the Inspector General for more civilian police oversight with the police department. And lastly, we also passed a use of force ordinance restricting the use of force by the Metro Police Department. And then some of us helped participate, myself, Councilman Ph.D. and Councilwoman Jessica Green, in selecting our new police chief, Miss Erika Shields. Glad you're on board. And you know, all those things are public policy pieces that the council has worked on. And as I've sat and listened to everybody talking, you know, I agree with everything a lot of the things I've heard people say. And, you know, Dr. Dawson-Edwards was talking early when she first started talking, and you know, the history of law enforcement. I read the book, Mr. Wright's book, and I give it away. I probably give away 2 copies a month to different people, because I think it's important everybody understand their history. And one of the things that I thought about when everything was starting last year is I would talk to different officers, and they would ask me, why are people so angry? And I would say, well, there's this history. And then I would start talking to them about the history. I'd talk to them about the consent decree. I'd talk to them about how I had broken teeth because police hit me in the mouth. You know, I'd talk to them about all those types of things. And then after I finished talking to them, they'd shake their heads and say, I didn't know that. And so I think we have failed as a city in preparing our police officers to go out and do the work in our city, because we haven't taught them that history, because they don't know it, obviously. I also feel that it's important to talk about things as they actually are. And what I mean by that is, it is true that the vast majority of police interactions go in a positive direction. And the ones that don't go in a positive direction, many of those we hear about, many of those we don't. But at the other side of it, when President Nichols was talking about the police contract, I would say that the police contract is a place where police reform can take place, because there are areas of the contract that need to be reformed. And many parts of it are embedded into state law. And so in order to change those things, we need to change state law and we need to change the contract. The other thing I would say is that I believe that everybody on this panel wants to get to a certain place. The question is, how do we get there? And whose ox gets gored along the way? As we on the Metro Council often pass legislation, and at the end of the day, when we finish that legislation and people are mad at each other on both sides of the aisle and everything, then I literally look at that and go, well, that's a good piece of legislation, because nobody's happy. And so I look at this situation also, and I say, we're going to yell and scream a lot, and we're going to fight, and we're going to cry, and people are going to be unhappy along the way. But that's the way it's supposed to be. It's going to be messy, but we're going to get there.
Well, thank you very much for the presentation. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to have a discussion. So we've heard many things that are stated here, but something that has struck me through this whole thing is everybody saying they want to get to the same place. It sounds like everybody wants fairness. Everybody wants justice. Everybody wants the police to protect and serve. And yet we have a report that says we are in a bad situation. In fact, we're in crisis. So something is really, really out of whack here. So I'm gonna begin with President James. And President James, and I would ask everybody to come off of your mute at this time, because I want you to join in as a subject matter that you may feel will contribute to the discussion, and you just chime in. But President James, you mentioned several things, but what do you see as the fundamental problem with the police community relationship? What's the fundamental problem that you see?
I think there's a big problem. I think that in one side of the fence, there's a portion of our community that has very little, if any, trust of the police. And then we have the police department and the officers that, for the vast majority, go to work every day thinking they're going to do the right thing and save and protect and all those good things. And without any understanding of the environment in which they're getting involved in. And when that happens, that means that the two sides are not communicating. I would also say that for the past 8 years, 8 years, that the Louisville Metro Police Department has not been run by a good ethical leader. And that's just the facts. And as long as that's taking place and the mayor doesn't hold that leader accountable, we end up with this mess. And that's where we are.
So, President Nichols, what is it that President James said that you disagree with? Or do you agree with him?
Well, I think we have a lot of common ground, as the FOP has been saying a lot of that message for a number of years. We had a no confidence vote in our previous chief and command staff. We've said there's been a lack of accountable leadership on LMPD, and that's at the top. And there's been talk of cover-ups and things that have happened within the department or the administration, and that doesn't happen at the officer level. A cover-up happens from the top. Officers don't have the ability to cover things up like that. So the FOP has been saying for a number of years that the leadership was a problem, or lack of leadership on this department was a problem. And it was going to lead us to areas where we've ended up. Metro Council has, they had a vote of no confidence in the mayor. And much of that evolved around the decisions to keep those leaders in the police department in place for so long. So that's been extremely problematic. We're on our fourth chief in less than a year now, and we're cautiously optimistic, and we look forward to working with Chief Shields, and we have hope that things can improve and leadership will be accountable, and we will actually have leadership on this police department. But hope is not a course of action, so we have to put boots on the ground and do the work. And when that happens, the police department and community, we will be together as we are, and we'll be in a better place. But until that happens, we're going to continue to have problems.
Well, I think leadership is important. There's no question about that. But that's too easy. That's too easy to put it on the mayor of the city. That's too easy to put it on some individual that did anything. And let me put it into context. I'm going back to you, President Nichols. And here's where I'm going with this. It's not the chief of police that's on the street that makes decisions on how they interact with the community. They do know better. They do know that they have discretion. They do know that they have responsibility. Wouldn't you agree? And not only that, let's put it into context here, because I can talk from personal experience. As growing up as a young man, I've been stopped multiple times for no apparent reason. I've been hit by police for no apparent reason, right in front of my house with dangerous objects like billy clubs. And so what I'm saying is the chief of police didn't do that. The mayor of the city didn't do that. And guess what? There are policies that we have to deal with. What is the responsibility of that officer? The officer, who I often say is the most powerful human being one-on-one with a person on the street. What's his responsibility?
Well, of course, all police officers have an obligation and a duty to act and conduct themselves in a legal, moral, and ethical to that standard when they're performing their duties. And I would venture to say that I've had numerous contacts in my career in working the West End where none of those things happened. I've used my discretion to do different things, as many officers have. Have there been incidents, as you just spoke of, as Council President James spoke up earlier, that have happened to people in our community? Yes, most definitely. And it's incumbent upon leadership to have policies in place, to have appropriate supervision, to be able to identify those things and prevent them from happening again in the future. So leadership has a key role in that, or a lack of leadership allows those things to continue. Now, I will say that definitely every officer is accountable for their actions, and they should be. And we as officers need to have the appropriate amount of training and education on all of this history, on everything in policing, on what our community wants. And we need truths to be told. We need that clear message to be out there. We can't allow a false message or a false narrative to change the concept of something that actually happened. And so those things are all vital.
So President Nichols has said officers do have a responsibility on the street. They do have a responsibility, and he's asking for, and actually laid out some things, Chief Shields. that leadership should do. And both have raised the question, President James and President Nichols, of the responsibility of leadership. So what do you bring to the table, President Shields? Chief Shields, with respect to the issues that have been raised by these two gentlemen?
So I think there's valid points all around. I think, at the end of the day, we're employing human beings. So there is going to be racism. There is going to be discrimination. There is going to be internal biases. And it's not any more confined to policing than it is any industry. It's just that our decision-making is far more impactful because of the powers we're afforded, right? So what I'll say is, I think what happens is you have to set a tenor within the agency that this behavior will not be tolerated. And that means that when you identify it, you truly hold a person accountable. In law enforcement, we've had a tendency forever to rationalize. And by that I mean, if we go out today and someone is, and I say, go clean up that area over there, and someone is jaywalking, we get the person, we arrest them for jaywalking. But if a cop is jaywalking, it's like, well, they had to do it because they had to get there, because here's why they had to get there. We have a tendency internally, it's part of our culture, to rationalize why our colleagues have done things. Because they are our colleagues, because we know them, because we're not just taking their actions for purely what they are, we're incorporating the relationship element of it. So the first thing is you have to show that you truly mean accountability is, I will require you to be responsible for not just the decision-making you made, but what you didn't do. And what I would submit to you is, in this day and age where we have body-worn cameras, and that was one of the great difficulties in law enforcement for years. You get in the patrol car, you go out, you don't know what somebody is doing. You might hear rumblings that they're engaging in misconduct, but it often was not easy to prove. It just wasn't. You knew it was there, but unless someone would step forward, especially one of their colleagues, you had no way of knowing. Body-worn cameras have opened the window into police conduct, and it is imperative that we leverage them so that we do see what our folks are doing when the camera's not on them. I do think that it's similar to a parent. If a parent says, don't be smoking weed, don't be using dope, but they're doing it, it's a mixed message. And I think often what you'll see is commanders and organizations will say this is the standard, but their actions completely belie what they're saying. Wasn't it the McDonald's that had this huge, great policy about you don't have relationships with employees and everybody get fired if they even looked at another employee? And then it comes out the CEO he's pretty much blown that out the window. Well, what have you done to the entire corporation? You've made, and I guarantee you employees knew that, right? So they're seeing that he's saying one thing, but he's behaving totally different on another. So how many people then had relationships internally because the CEO is doing it? So I think that how leaders conduct themselves is imperative, but more so it is, we have an obligation to truly hold people accountable for their actions. And I'm not so keen to just give folks a pass. I think most people and most police know what they're doing when they do wrong.
Well, I appreciate that comment, and I'm going to, in a minute, segue over to Dr. Dawson-Edwards. But before I go there, I hear these words, I hear what you're saying, but we also know that there's a generational cultural piece within the police department, and you can do what you want as leader, Chief Shields. You can go in there and try everything that you want, but you're not on the street everywhere. How can you aggressively address these issues? And what does this mean in terms of time? And I know you have no crystal ball. Mm-hmm. What does this mean? What are your expectations in terms of change, dynamic,
literally, Okay, for LMPD. Well, yeah. So, I mean, the beauty of it is I walk in right around the time this Hilliard-Hines report is coming out. And that's huge because I can speak all day long, but there are people who do not agree with us at all. They don't think there's a problem. Nothing's broken. There you go. Hilliard-Hines provided what I needed to sell to that audience that was on that fence. And that is data. The data has clearly shown that there are practices and patterns within the police department that are just flat wrong. And what it's also given is a roadmap of how do this is what needs to be addressed immediately to fix this. So it is there, we have a number of things in motion simultaneously to get a handle on this. I just met with some technology people today. I need a dashboard that I can see real time. What is our traffic ticket data? What is the data? Where are we stopping people? Because if we're stopping people in an area that's 95% white and we have 60% black motorists being stopped, I mean, okay, you're not going to win the argument that you're not profiling. But I don't want to see that data 3 months out, 6 months out. I want it real time so that we can address the behavior immediately. On terms of doing operational policies and getting the violence down, it's going after guns that are committing the violence, not the drugs, where people may or may not be associated with violence, or they may just be smoking weed. I mean, that's like throwing spaghetti against the wall. You can't have a plan that goes that way. The hiring, we're woefully short on Black officers. And the most critical thing is to have a diverse department. So we're making aggressive inroads to shore up diversity. But I will say to you is, I will hold my commanders responsible. I have made it clear to them what my direction is. And they have an obligation to go and execute on it. And if they fail, they're out. They're out of their seat. We have an obligation to police Louisville in a manner that is fair and consistent. But until I show that I am willing to hold those folks of the high rank accountable, it's not going to make it down to the bottom levels.
Well, I'm going to ask Dr. Dawson-Edwards to put all of this into context. And after that, I'm going to turn it over to my co-moderator because you raised the Hilliard-Hines report. And I'm going to ask my co-moderator to delve down in that. And we'll see exactly what that says. Dr. Dawson-Edwards, into context.
So yeah, that was a lot to take in, but I think I want to go towards, I know in Chief Shield's bio, it talked about her being a proponent for 21st century policing. And so I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about this building trust and legitimacy. I think it's pillar 1 in 21st century policing. And it talks about procedurally just policing in the report, in that 21st century policing report. And it says there are 4 central principles of being procedurally just, and that is treating people with dignity and respect, giving individuals voice during encounters, being neutral and transparent in decision-making, and conveying trustworthy motives. And so I'm not asking Chief Shields necessarily to, respond to this, but maybe President Nichols and President James, like, do we really feel like in this city that our interactions with the police and Black folks in the city, people feel like they've been treated with dignity and respect? Do we really feel like we're given voice during encounters? Do we feel like there's neutral and transparency in decision-making? Do we feel like they're conveying trustworthy motives? I mean, that's 21st century policing. That's the building trust and legitimacy pillar. And we can talk about accountability, and I'm glad to hear, Chief Shields, I'm glad to hear you say that you're holding your command staff accountable. President Nichols referred to, they have an obligation to be morally and ethically fair and just and all these things, but we don't necessarily feel that. And so I'm going to wear really quickly my hat as a mom, because of course I understand policing. I've been teaching criminal justice since 2002. I've been studying it for even longer. And so I get it, but I also get being a community member and being someone from and of the city who's raising a child or raising a teenage boy in the city. And I want to give a really quick anecdote. My son was in public school all the way up until last year in 8th grade. He went to Westport Middle School. He went to Chansey Elementary School. I pulled him out of public school for 9th grade. He goes to Kentucky Country Day. And for those of you who don't know, that's far northeast Louisville. It's by the Paddock Shops. It used to be called the Summit if you're from Louisville. And the other week, he plays basketball. He said, Mom, I'm going to stay after. Me and my, 2 friends are going to stay after, in between the basketball game. We're going to go over and go to Five Guys or something. I was like, I don't know, like 3 6-foot-tall Black boys who are 14 and 15. My son's only 14, walking around the Paddock Shops. I don't know that that's a very good idea. And this is just my inclination as a mom, as a Black mom in the city. And it wasn't the store owners per se. It might be what they might call the police. What are these 3 Black boys doing over here? And this is what my son said to me. He said, oh, we'll be fine. We'll have KCD everything on. And it was the first moment as a Black mom in this city that I said, you know what, he might be right. But for the last 14 years, it didn't dawn on me that that's what I always felt like that's his presence in the city. And for the first time, because he goes to an expensive private school, and I know that's privilege, even though I'm a Black woman, I mean, that's privilege that he goes, but it was like, oh, this is what other people feel like. They don't have to think about how their child navigates, or they don't have to think about the potential interaction of their Black son with police officers in the city. And for that fleeting moment, I realized that maybe for the next 3 years that he's in high school and he's walking across the street to go to Five Guys with KCD hoodies on, he might be okay. I've never felt like that. And he's 14. And so I can be a criminal justice professor, I can be an associate dean, but I'm a mom at the end of the day. And when I show up as that as well. And so just know that even people who understand the job of the police, I know what you are supposed to do. I know what you can do. I teach people what you can do. I still feel like that. And that's the truth. That's a community member and a mom of a Black boy in the city. And that's how I feel today.
Well, thank you for that input. I'm gonna go to my co-moderator, Judge Brown. Judge Brown, I would ask you to go where you want to go, but I really specifically would think it'd be really important to home in on the Hilliard Heinz report and make that a piece of the discussion. And I would invite everyone or anyone other than who Judge Brown directs it to chime in to help us get to the bottom of this. Yes.
And just to make sure that everyone is aware of what the report entailed, that it's the Hilliard Heinz report, and what it was a top to bottom review of the LMPD policies, practices, and procedures. And it indicated some key findings and recommendations. And you've heard people refer to the report, and it was supposed to be a roadmap. It's about 286 pages long, maybe even longer. But if you think about that, some folks may wonder, will we ever get to that point with a roadmap that's 286 pages long? Somehow we're going to have to work together on some similar things in order to make some progress. And so the roadmap basically is to establish a new policing environment where the department and the community are equal partners in the co-production of public safety. That's a lot of things. It can mean a lot of things to different people. But tonight, what I'd like to ask you, each of you, because it sets out some immediate goals, some things that need to happen right away, as well as some things that need to happen over 3 to 5 years. And I feel like because of the year that we've had, it has just been atrocious. It has shaken the confidence of the community and all of the branches of government, everything that has happened in this past 2020. But they want to know, what are we going to do right now? So I would like to hear from each of you. What would you designate as your top 3 priorities of what you can do right now? What can you do right now? And Chief Shields, I know you talked about the dashboard and you talked about diversity, hiring, and all of those things are great, but those are going to take time. Right? It's still looking backwards. It's still getting the data and looking back at the data for some direction. And I feel like the folks that are listening to us now, the viewers, they want to know, what are we going to do now? And so I would like to start with Chief Shields and then move through the rest of the panel with what are the top 3 priorities that you see that you can do right now that would make a difference.
Thank you, Judge. I think that it's a unique space to be in, because what we haven't really delved into is the violent crime that's occurring. So you have this dramatic increase in violent crime in the community that least wants to see and trust the police. And so if we're going to get our arms around the crime, at some level, we have to be proactive as opposed to just reactive. And I would say that for me, there are a number of initiatives afoot immediately, but first and foremost is identifying how we're going to tackle the violent crimes so we're not having this constant loss of life, but doing it in a manner that even if we're not welcome in the community, they understand that we're there with a very pointed goal of reducing violence. And so for me, it's internal and external. External, it's messaging as much as possible to the community, meeting many of the communities I can to say, we want to focus on violent crime, gun crime, to make your neighborhood safer. We're not coming out here to just do 3,000 traffic stops and hopefully get some illegal guns. It's focused on those individuals who have committed violence, are known to be violent offenders. It's intelligence-led policing. Simultaneously, and as important is meeting with the internal officers, sergeants, lieutenants, everyone, so they understand the message and the direction that we're going. It's imperative that this department move in the same direction. And it's imperative that they understand how I expect them to accomplish this. That it is possible to rein in violent crime without having officer-involved shootings. I've done it. And it's really taking an educated, thoughtful approach each night and each time you go out. So for me, without question, it's getting the department, excuse me, to a space where we can tackle this violence, but it's not in a manner that is heavy-handed. So that is absolutely the priority of priorities, while simultaneously going on with it, of course, is meeting with so many people who feel or were involved in the protests last year and had interactions with police that were negative. It's reassuring them, especially as we come up on Breonna Taylor's 1-year anniversary of her death, that they understand that I expect and encourage them to be protesting, to be out there, to be celebrating her life. I'm working with them to identify a manner in which we can do it so that it's done safely for everyone. There's so much healing that has to be done in so many sections. So I think those, without question, coming in, it's been getting my arms around the community so that they understand that LMPD is expected to support them while simultaneously having to navigate the dicey road of we have to do some level of enforcement proactively if we're going to rein in violent crime.
President Nichols, 3 priorities that you would focus on.
Thank you, ma'am. I would also echo that getting a handle on the violent crime issue within our city should be a #1 priority. Public safety is the #1 priority of responsibility of government, and we need to address those issues. And yes, like Chief Shields says, that's going to take proactive police work. And yes, communicating that to members of the community, to the police department, and making it very clear what the mission and the focus is for officers to go out and do those jobs. When you are targeting those violent criminals, as Chief Shields said, that's just what they are. They're violent criminals. The probability of some type of violent encounter with the police when they become much more proactive is going to increase. And so we have to address that. We have to be prepared for that. We have to understand what that means. Yes, the police have to go out and act in a fair and just and legal manner. But when violence is used against police, they will defend themselves. And that probability is exponentially increased when these type of activities take place, when we get our violent crime to a level that it is, and then try to gain control of that situation again. So it becomes extremely problematic, and it's going to have to take a full effort from the community, from the police department, from our elected officials. And that communication piece to everyone involved, I think, is going to be very, very critical. I think another big issue in the Hilliard and Heights report was as it related to discipline within the police department. The insane amount of time that discipline-related complaint investigations take within the department, or have taken within the department up to this point, is absurd. It's not fair to the community member who may have made that complaint, to the officer who's being looked at to determine if they did or did not do anything wrong. Those things, those investigations, by the contract that we referenced earlier, all of that process should be done within 180 days. And there are some specific investigations and some extenuating circumstances where some of those investigations could take longer, but by and large, every investigation on LMPD takes longer than that. And that's unacceptable. Like I said, to the community members who are voicing those complaints, and to the officers who are working. And if an officer did make a mistake and does get disciplined, discipline should be designed to correct that behavior so it doesn't happen again in the future, and we have a better, more productive police department. But with the state of the discipline and the investigations as they're currently in our department, it's unacceptable, and those things aren't happening. When you receive discipline for something that happened over 2 years ago, you very well may have been doing that same action the entire 2 years you've been under investigation, because you didn't know you were doing anything wrong in the eyes of the department. So it's very crucial for that discipline process to be much faster and efficient. Good order and discipline is required in any large agency such as this. And then I would say that the other information from that report, I would say I don't know that it's a roadmap to our success in the future, as it is maybe a starting point. The real-time data that the chief is referencing, I think, is very crucial. The data that was pulled for this report was not a holistic look at the data. When we reference a certain division and the number of residents and the race of those residents in that division and the number of traffic stops that were made in the race of the driver, they didn't take into account, well, is this a business district? Is this an entertainment district? Are there a lot of influx of people who don't live in this district there during the daytime or the nighttime when these traffic stops are occurring? What crime is going on in these areas when these traffic stops may be occurring? There's so much more information that needs to be looked at to have a holistic view of what type of policing is going on in a specific area. And I think that data needs to be gathered. I'm glad to see that the chief is developing some ways to get more of that real time, and that commanders are going to be looking at that and accountable for the actions that occur as a result of that.
Right. So I'm going to keep bringing this back to the report, and what it says is there to establish, which is a new policing environment where the LMPD and the community are equal partners in the co-production of public safety. So I will agree with you that there probably was not enough data reviewed, because they only looked at 1 year, 2018 to 2019. That was the only year that they took all the data for. So obviously there needs to be a more comprehensive look at the total amount of data. But I'm really wanting our viewers to hear, how are we going to have LMPD and the community become partners, equal partners in the production of public safety? And President James, if you could speak to that, and in what perhaps maybe Metro Council might be thinking about doing or considering to meet that end.
Thank you, Judge. So I think one of the things in the Hilliard Heights report, it talks about the co-production of public safety. It talks about the formation of a committee work group of citizens and police officers that sit down together to talk about the policies of the police department. What is it that the citizens want the police to do? How do they want to be protected? And to talk through those things and have the police talk about, well, what that looks like, right? And I think that's very important for that to happen. And so, because as we talk about violent crime in our community, the reality is that the police can't solve violent crime unless the community is willing to participate in that solving of the violent crime. And they're not going to participate in the solving of the violent crime if they don't trust the police. And so there has to be some trust with the police department in order for the community to come forward and talk and say, you know, so-and-so shot so-and-so, right? Or I was there when this happened, or whatever information they provide. People are not going to provide information to the police to solve these crimes, to make these families whole again, if they don't trust the police to do the right thing and to protect them. And so I think it's vitally important that that takes place. And I think another thing that I've been talking to some people in the community is that a lot of times there may be a drive-by shooting or a homicide that takes place someplace, and you have victims there that are afraid to return back home again because things are so unstable that they fear bringing their children back into that apartment complex or that apartment building or wherever that may be. And so I think that it's time for the council to work with the police department to set up a fund, whether we call it a victim protection fund or relocation fund, whatever it is, because a lot of times you physically need to take somebody from the environment that they're in to put them in a safer place, because they're not going to talk about anything, they're not going to see anything, and they're not going to do anything with their children there if they're afraid of their children being injured. And so many times people have to be in a better situation. I kind of think of it as the Red Cross. If a building catches fire, a house catches fire, the Red Cross comes in and they move people. Sometimes they just put them in a hotel for a couple of weeks so they can get reestablished. But the disaster of having a shooting taking place in the building you live in or the house you live in is no different than a fire taking place. It's an emergency, and we need to treat it as an emergency, and we need to treat people as if they're people and not just numbers, because that's what we do right now. We say, oh, there was 173 murders last year and 700 shootings, and we just treat them as numbers. Those are people. Those are people's families and children. And so we have to, if we really want to solve these issues, we not only have to look at it as the crimes that are taking place, but what were the root causes of that, right? What were the root causes that put people in this poverty situation? What were the root causes that made so-and-so get into a situation that they couldn't get out of? And what tools do we have available to help get them out of those situations? We have to get out on the front end of this. Right now, what we're doing is picking up the pieces after things happen. And I feel it's very important that the police are out doing their job and things like that, but we also have to get ahead of the violent crime, and we have to treat the situation as it is and actually put ourselves in that situation and think, what is it that we can do if we were in that? What would we want to have done to help us get out of those situations and those environments? And I think those are some of the things that I'm looking at as we go forward. But again, I would say that community trust and transparency by government is paramount to this whole thing.
Dr. Dawson-Edwards, what would you add to the discussion?
Yeah, I would first say that the idea that we need more data to explain racialized policing or race-based stops just is problematic to me. I wrote my master's thesis in 1999 on racialized policing. It's 2021. Like, there's a bunch of literature out there that explains why that is. And I don't believe, I mean, I'm sure that they will collect the data. I'm sure a researcher, not me, but another researcher will be happy to analyze it. But I don't think you're going to find anything that much different than other cities that have similar problems. The literature is there. So I'm glad to hear President James talk about root causes, because I don't know that we need any more proof about the racialized policing. We need to be figuring out why this is happening and what we can do to fix it. And as someone who gets paid to do research for governmental agencies, not police departments, I shouldn't be saying that, right? Because sure, like pay us to research, but no, we no longer need numbers. We know that it's happening. We need the why and the how to get out of it. And so I just want to say that first from my academic lens. As far as what we can do now, I will say that one of the things that I liked about the report was the section on it that talked about developing a written community engagement strategy that includes goals, measurable objectives, and performance measures for all department personnel, regardless of their assignment. And I even push a little bit further, and forgive me, I'm going to wear my Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Engagement hat here and say that it needs to be an anti-racist community engagement strategy, that we have to call things what they are, and that if there are problems with race-based policing, and that needs to be part of the strategy to engage the community and tell the truth. And so I would say that we need to dismantle systems and structures, policies and procedures that are based on oppression. And that's what you would get if you had the community truly engaged in a strategy for LMPD. You would get conversations like that. That's not been said here tonight. And I just want to name it and say that if you're interested in building trust and legitimacy with certain segments of the community, not the segment where I live, but if you're interested, well, people like me that live in that segment, but not the majority of people that live there, then you have to have honest conversations about it. So it says, these individuals can help promote and enable conversations between the community and the department. You should find community influencers. So I want to talk about that for a second, because community influencers are often people that are hand-selected or who are already at the table. What I think we learned last year is there's a lot of community influencers that just are boots to the ground, that are grassroots. They know their stuff. I've never seen a Louisville with this many just regular folks knowing as much about the police as they do, and I love it. They know FOP contract language. They know, they know their council person. They know they know the local government. We are becoming an educated populace as it relates to this, and it's a beautiful thing for me as an educator to see. So I would say, get with the community, do that anti-racist community engagement strategy. And that's how, like President James said, you're going to get people to help you make this a safer, less violent city.
Okay, all right. And so to rebuild the public trust, I'm going to start with you, President Nichols, and ask you, what would you do as the FOP president or others in your organization to rebuild community and public trust in the police? And then I'm gonna come back to Chief Shields and ask her, how would you work on improving police morale? And then I'll get feedback from President James and Dr. Dawson-Edwards on those same two questions. So
let's limit those comments to about 2 minutes, because we're getting toward the end of our time. Thank you.
How would you improve the community trust of police officers, President Nichols?
Well, I think it's very key to engage the community, as many members here have said tonight. You have to have adequate manpower that allows you to do those things. You have to be able to, not just in a professional setting, hey, we're going to call a meeting, but you need officers that are out engaging the community as they work. They need to be able to talk to folks in the neighborhoods, business owners, know what's going on their beat in their neighborhood, so to speak. So we need an adequate staff. We need an adequate manpower level to do those things. And we need the directive and the support from the administration to be able to get out and do those things and go away from, as Chief Shields referenced earlier, a CompStat type mentality where you're driven by your productivity is gauged and by the numbers of arrests or the number of statistics that you have, and just look at it, a total picture view of did you and were you able to affect safety in the area in which you work.
Are you saying the public trust, though, has been broken because there wasn't enough police force, the number of people.
I'm saying that has an effect on it because we lose the ability to get out and engage on an individual basis. And I think that's vital to community trusting the police that work in their area, in their neighborhood, knowing that beat officer, knowing different officers in your area. So you feel comfortable calling them, maybe not when everyone's around and that emergency is going on, but after the scene calms down and you want to provide some information, you trust those individuals, you've had contact with them, and you're able to reach out and make that contact and give information that allows the police to solve crime and make your neighborhoods a safer place.
Mm-hmm. All right, Chief Shields. Morale, that's been a big issue. I mean, there have been several articles written about how low morale is for our current department. What will you do to increase that?
Thank you, Judge. So I think first off is it's imperative, incumbent upon me to hold my commanders accountable. I think we've all worked for organizations where they preach a solid message, but then you see that they don't deal with the underperforming employee.
And you know what? That is a perfect word to use, the accountability, because I've been following the chat. And every time you said accountability, I see a whole bunch of thumbs up and hearts and things. But how are you going to hold them accountable? How are you going to?
So I think that, if I'm pitching a message of performance and accountability, I have to show that I'm willing to do it with the people who are tasked with running the police department. It's not enough to just go into the entry-level officer and hammer them. How are the people who are leading the department performing? Because that is a direct contributor to morale. There's no two ways about it. You also have to create an environment that is one of equality. Are opportunities being afforded based on fairness, true fairness, and an equitable chance at something, or is it favoritism? Is it race related? Is it people that go to lunch together? Do people have the opportunity to grow based on the environment things being managed objectively? I'll also tell you this, is a police department, my mission and my goal is to ensure that this police department is highly trained, has shown that it has navigated reform, and it is a benchmark for the United States. Yes, we're at a bottom now, but the good thing about a bottom is it presents the opportunity to get to the top. It is not going to be quick. It is not going to be easy. But as we work through that, the demands on the department will continue to grow. I want employees to be professional and excellent. And to that end, it's also my responsibility as the CEO to say, if we want these employees to be top tier, they have to be compensated top tier. You cannot be, if you're the largest city in Kentucky, it's not a good business model. If you're the largest city in Kentucky and these officers are facing the most violence and you don't want to lose talent, you have to retain talent. You have to attract it and you have to retain it. You have to compensate them appropriately. And we went through the same thing in Atlanta, is we would lose very good people for $10,000 to a suburb. And it's just, it's not a good business model. And it also doesn't allow you to get to the place of professionalism that you want to be. So there's a lot of things in motion, but we'll get there. I believe it. Thank you, Judge.
Dr. Dawson-Edwards, what would that anti-racist model look like that you were referring to?
I haven't seen one, but I've also not seen our city have a community engaged written strategy with the police and the community as well. What I will say is I have not read all however many pages of the report because I focused on the community engaged pieces, but President Nichols brought up the discipline issues. And so I think as people, as you look at LMPD policies or SOPs or whatever, and you look at them from an equity conscious lens, then you may see where there are certain policies that impact people differently. And is there a way, given that, he says that the FOP contract's not a place for reform, which I agree with President James. I think it absolutely is. But if you look at certain policies and procedures, do they impact people differently? And again, Chief Shields talks about how, you know, the law and the Constitution and the, you know, Supreme Court interpretations of the Constitution are the bottom of what you have to do. And you know that, Judge, you know, there are cities that provide more protection. So they go higher than just the bottom, you know, and I understand when she said that it's easier to train and say, this is black and white, you know, but at the same time, I think that we need to really look at our internal policies and see where those policies are impacting people differently. I also am curious, and I just don't know this, because of the turnover, and I used to do research on turnover intentions for correctional officers, not police officers, but I just wonder if there's ever been any research on officer turnover intentions, and in the difference between turnover and turnover intentions is that you haven't lost them yet. You know, and so identifying who might be on their way, thinking about leaving, why are they leaving, what can we do, what can you do, you know, to work on that while they're still there. And then the other thought, I'm wearing my public policy administration hat here for a minute. The other thought is like, are there exit interviews? And I guess I could ask my colleague who's co-teaching my class with me, you know, why are people leaving? And then furthermore, why aren't they coming? There's this narrative out there that it's about pay and pension, but guess what? We lost criminal justice majors too, right? And our majors have shifted in the last several years from wanting to be police officers to not wanting to be police officers. So it's not just a matter, there's an interest or disinterest in policing that people need to have a conversation about as well. And it's not just pay.
Okay, and President James, if you could round out, you know, the balancing of those two, restoring public trust while at the same time improving police morale. What would you suggest?
All right, I'm going to do this in 1 minute and 30 seconds.
Absolutely.
I think that it's important to improve the police morale. I think one of the key factors in police morale is good leadership. And that means good leadership all the way around. It means good leadership from elected officials, good leadership from the police chief on down. To Dr. Dawson-Edwards' point, the former police chief didn't care about exit interviews, didn't want exit interviews because he knew what people were going to tell him. And he felt that morale was not his problem and that it was the officer's problem, which is how we ended up here. The other part of that, I think it's very important for on the police side and the FOP side to acknowledge that, yeah, because I've heard them say it, that police officers do good jobs and things like that, but also to acknowledge when they screw up, right? I've not heard the FOP say it, but the FOP officers do screw up, right? And I've heard Chief Shields say it just the other day when they messed up about the homeless situation. And I was so proud that happened because that has not been something that's happened for many years on our police department. And so I think that people don't expect us to be perfect, but they do expect that when we mess up, that we say we mess up. And so I think that the two sides working together can help get us there, but we've got a long ways to go. I don't want anybody to be mistaken. Our police department has a long ways to go, and our police chief has a big load to carry. And so I'm here to support the FOP, the citizens, and the police department as we go down that road. But it's going to be a hard road to get to.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to turn it back over to my co-moderator. But just if he gives me 10 seconds, I want to acknowledge that it is International Women's Day today. And so I want to celebrate the accomplishments of Chief Shields and Dr. Cheri Dawson-Edwards. And of course, we celebrate you men as well, but on another day. But today is all about the women. And I wanted to get that in there. Senator Neal.
Well, I'm glad you did because I joined you in that celebration. And thank you for pointing that out. And thank you, ladies, for being present and providing such substance to this discussion. Let me say that this has been a substantive discussion. I think there's so much to deal with that it's going to take a whole lot to get to it. I mean, it's like it didn't just come to the point today. I mean, it's evolved over time. So I'm going to ask you a very critical question, panelists. Will you be willing to come back and continue this discussion individually and collectively as we go forward? Can we count on you on that? Okay, wonderful. I love that. I want to thank each of the panelists for this straightforward discussion. We're going to continue this into the future. we're looking forward for good results. I can sum it up by saying that I agree with the comments that was made that I think we all want these objectives at the end where there's a win-win all the way around. And we know there's going to be a tough road to do, but it's something that can be done. I really particularly like the discussion that challenges us that comes from Dr. Cheri Dawson-Edwards when she raises the question, you know, we can talk about all this long-term stuff and obviously that must be done, but there are things we can do now and we can undertake decisive, obvious steps that telegraph our intention, but also can end in substantive change. And I think I sense a willingness here in these panelists. So I think we got something to work with going forward. So I congratulate you on that. And I look forward to our continuing discussion. I also want to thank my co-moderator who did an excellent job. I laid back. Normally I get involved more than I did when I even have a co-moderator, but she was going so good. I said, let me just stay out of this. She's got this. She knows what she's doing. So she's done a tremendous job and I appreciate that. And I want to thank our co-host, the Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, for not only joining us here, but also for the work that you've done over the decades, not just in Louisville, Kentucky, across this nation and around the world. Applause to you, applause to you. And lastly, I wanted to thank my co-collaborators, or our co-conveners, as well as our collaborators. And I'm talking here of not only AARP of Kentucky, but also the Psi Boule of Sigma Pi Phi Fraternity Incorporated, as well as WLOU 1350 on your dial. With that being said, I want to thank everyone for joining us. Come back and join us again as we go forward, and good night.